So just picking up on those George Martin centenary videos about the first Beatles audition in 1962, just a few thoughts. Isn't it interesting how, when you look into the details of that famous event, you realise that it isn't really the stroke of destiny. You know, there wasn't some kind of divine moment when the hand of God pointed out the Beatles to George Martin, and with a deep sense that this is the historical moment, he signed them. In fact, this was a band who weren't doing terribly well, had been rejected in other auditions, turn up at EMI. And really, because he feels sorry for Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, George Martin agrees to give them an hour in the recording studio, turns up, has a cup of tea, isn't that interested in what they're doing, comes back a little bit later in the session, tells them what's wrong with the act. And it seems that because of George Harrison's characteristically dry Liverpudlian comment, well, I don't like your tie either, which in fact would be a fatal comment to make to a more stuffy studio executive of that era. That's the moment that seals the deal in a funny way. It signals some kind of era-defining change. George Martin, who's a young producer, is somehow aware at that moment that this is something interesting, and he signs the band on the basis of the character of the Beatles, the sort of wit and the charm that they seem to exude, the rebelliousness that they seem to exude at that moment in the studio. That's the defining moment. It's not the music. And heaven knows, you know, I admire the Beatles because of their music. Of course I do. They're astonishing. And it's the synergy of that band and the individual egos in that band, and the individual creativities in that band, with the marvellous musicianship of George Martin, who himself turns out to be a key component in the history of the Beatles, without question. I find this all very fascinating because that is an era-defining moment. I mean, there's no question. And the Beatles go on to be perhaps one of the most important events in the 1960s. And it's all because of something actually quite random, a contingent moment in audition when George Martin, unconvinced by the band in their musical performance, signs them anyway on a whim. Isn't that fascinating?